All right, guys, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today is my scouting report of the Falcons' 2021 third-round pick in offensive lineman Jalen Mayfield out of Michigan. We'll talk about his strengths, his weaknesses, and how he projects to the NFL on today's episode.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP, still going strong, however, on Twitter at FalcFans, and, of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Built Bar. Go to BuiltBar.com, use the promo code LOCKED15, and you'll get 15% off your next order. Today's episode of Locked On Falcons is continuing our 2021 draft breakdown as we go through each of the 9 Falcons draft selections from last month and give a detailed scouting report. And we're now on the third selection in that 2021 draft class, and offensive lineman Jalen Mayfield out of Michigan. He's a player that I have discussed quite a bit on previous episodes of the podcast. He was not necessarily my favorite pick of this 2021 draft class. In today's episode, I'll get further into why I was not a huge fan of him, but I won't necessarily try to rehash some things that we've talked about quite a bit on this podcast in terms of my concerns about Jalen Mayfield. If you missed Friday's episode, we went into that towards the end of that episode, making some comparisons, some red flags that I had watching Jalen Mayfield that reminded me a little too much of former Falcons second round offensive line bust, if you want to call it that, in Peter Kahns from 2012. And so go listen to that episode. We won't necessarily rehash those things, but today's episode, we're going to be talking quite a bit about the projection of Jalen Mayfield and why there's a little bit of a leap to try to look at him as what he was at Michigan and try to project what he will be in the NFL in Atlanta, playing a guard and making that transition from tackle to guard. We'll talk quite a bit about that. And then, of course, as usual, we'll talk about the strengths, the weaknesses, or at least in Jalen Mayfield's case, the question marks that we have that we perceive as weaknesses and why we perceive them as weaknesses with his game. And then, of course, we'll wrap things up by getting into some NFL player comparisons, looking at Mayfield's floor, his starting point entering the NFL, his ceiling, sort of his maximum potential as an NFL player, and then what's probably going to be where he winds up being is his eye level, which is halfway between the floor and the ceiling. And we'll get into that later on today's episode. But starting things off, today's buzzword is going to be words like project and projection. We could do a Pee Wee Herman thing where every time you hear that word, you go crazy or whatever the case may be. And project, in the sense, there's no other way to cut it. Jalen Mayfield is a project, and you can call it bias, but I'm not necessarily a huge fan of projects because experience has taught me that for every project that makes it in the NFL, there's 5 or 10 that do not make it in the NFL. And to me, I liken it to being thrown into the deep end of a pool, an hour after your first swim lesson. And maybe you tread water and are fine with it, but more often than not, you're not necessarily going to be. And the NFL stands for not for very long. And if you get thrown to the wolves, you get thrown into the fire, before you're ready and you can't hack it, NFL teams are going to replace you. And if you're not thrown into the fire and you're sort of waiting for your opportunity, riding the bench, getting developed, well, that means other players are getting those opportunities. And if those players wind up taking advantage of those opportunities, you're going to get passed by and never get that chance. And that's one of the big reasons why the hit rate for NFL teams when it comes to draft picks is so low, because the odds aren't stacked in their favor. And when it comes to projection, a lot of times these young players, they're going to be doing things in the NFL that they didn't do very often in college. And obviously Mayfield falls into that camp, spent one full season as a starting right tackle for Michigan as a sophomore in 2019. Then this past year began the season as their starting right tackle again, but then suffered a high ankle sprain that caused him to miss all but 2 games this year. And here in Atlanta, he's going to be asked to play left guard. That's a projection. And projection isn't always bad. You take Keanu Neal, for an instance. At Florida, Keanu Neal was mostly a single high free safety that didn't spend a ton of time in the box, was rarely asked to play man coverage. So when you projected him to his fit as a strong safety in the cover 3 scheme, playing that Cam Chancellor role that Cam Chancellor made famous in Seattle, you saw some things that you liked with Keanu Neal and some question marks. As far as Keanu Neal's physicality, even though he wasn't often on display playing in the box at Florida, when he was in that role, you saw that ability. Now, when it came to covering tight ends and man coverage, that was a big question mark. He didn't do that very often at Florida. And on the handful of plays where you did see him do that, there was good, there was bad, and there was a lot in between. And it was a significant question mark for Neal as he transitioned to the NFL. And it was why, a lot of people, including myself, did not consider him, quote unquote, worthy of a first round grade. But notably, the Falcons did work out Keanu Neal pre-draft. Dan Quinn took his coaching staff to Florida's campus and did pre-draft on-campus workout with Keanu Neal and several of his Florida teammates, put him through drills that they wanted to see him in order to project his ability to play in that Cam Chancellor role at the next level. And obviously, Neal passed that with flying colors, enough to be the Falcons' number 1 pick in that 2016 draft. So us on the outside probably had a lower opinion of Neal than the Falcons internally did. And their opinion wound up winning out in that regard. But with Mayfield, you don't necessarily have those same circumstances. Due to COVID, those pre-draft on-campus workouts didn't occur this year like they do every other year. Now, maybe Mayfield was able to do some of the things at the Michigan Pro Day, as you got sort of an extended Pro Day because of the lack of these on-campus workouts. And maybe the Falcons coaches were there and saw some of the things that they needed to see in order to project Mayfield better to playing guard in this outside zone scheme than he would look at first sight just watching the film. But obviously, I can only go off of the things that I've seen. And so it requires a little bit of an imagination to see how Mayfield projects in Atlanta. And anyone that listens to this podcast on a regular basis knows that I tend to believe things when I see it. So I guess I have a lack of imagination when it comes to this stuff. And what's going to be interesting in 3 years from now, we're going to have all the information that we need to have at that point and be able to look back at this episode and look back at my various opinions on Jalen Mayfield and whether I was right and was right to be low on him, or whether I was wrong and should have been higher on him. And it's a question of will he provide those answers? And we'll know 3 years from now if he does. And I tend to try to learn from my mistakes. And in my experience, the majority of the times where I wind up being wrong on things, it usually often boils down to not having all the information that I needed in order to have the correct opinion. And so I think if I'm wrong on Mayfield, it may just boil down to not having all that information. So the bulk of today will be about some of those questions to his games that we're going to have to project for him. But I do want to start things on a more positive note, talking about some of the things that Mayfield does well. As a run blocker, that's probably the strength of his game. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the NBA side of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you can find a daily podcast devoted to your favorite NBA team. Whether your team is in the playoffs, like the Atlanta Hawks, find the Locked On Hawks podcast hosted by Brad Rowland on your favorite podcast platform, including the Odyssey app. Who doesn't want instant gratification? If you're looking for satisfaction, there's no need to wait. With Credit Karma Money, you could win cash reimbursements for debit purchases. When you use your Credit Karma Money debit card, you can win daily instant karma purchase reimbursements on items up to $5,000. Just pay with your debit card, and if you win, you'll be notified on the spot, and your instant karma cash will be added back to your spend account. Credit Karma Money has given away over $3 million in instant karma to over 50,000 Credit Karma members and counting. Open your FDIC insured spend account for free. There's no minimum balance requirements, no overdraft fees, and free withdrawals from a network of over 50,000 ATMs. Right now, just visit creditkarma.com/winmoney to open your free account and start winning instant karma. Go to creditkarma.com/winmoney to sign up for free and start winning instant karma. That's creditkarma.com/winmoney. Instant karma is sponsored by Credit Karma. No purchase necessary. Exclusions and terms apply. See rules. Banking services provided by MVB Bank Incorporated, member FDIC. Maximum balance and transfer limits apply. He's not a guy that's going to be a pile moving, a road grading guy that is going to move guys off the ball. But he's a decent run blocker that does a good job getting position, can get seals and create those alleys for running backs. He does a good job as a puller. You know, you put together his highlight reel, you're going to see a couple of plays where he's out there pancaking linebackers and defensive backs. And that's probably his greatest strength, you know, that pancaking ability, because Mayfield's a nasty, mean guy. He's a finisher. You hear it called mean streak, and he's going to play at times to and beyond the whistle. He's going to get after guys. And thus, you know, that ability with the development potential, when you hear people talk about Mayfield's strengths, you're going to hear them talk about, while he's not a pile mover, you know, with more refinement, he can be a good run blocker because of that ability to finish. And rather than me sitting here explaining, I'll let Duke Manyweather, an offensive line guru that runs offensive line OL masterminds, explain about finishing. You know, this is a video that he put out several years ago on his Twitter at Big Duke 50, and you'll see pop up every now and then, year after year. And he talks about the importance of finishing for offensive linemen and why it matters. And it's a 90-second video. He did record it on his phone in his car, so the audio gets a little rougher towards the end, but the core of the message is still valuable. And let's play that right now.
Finishing on the offensive line is not overrated by any means. And you can ask any coach at any level, any offensive lineman at any level, is non-negotiable. There are even front offices who value it as non-negotiable. You have to be finishing. Just like in sales, always be closing, offensive linemen always be finishing. Now, finishing doesn't always have to be a pancake or a knockdown, but it's providing that added extra to defenders each play and each chance you get to let them know that you're going to be there all game, that you're not going anywhere. It's a mindset. It's tone setting. Defenders hate being finished, whether it's an added extra shove and they have to adjust their pads, whether it's being flat backed, or whether it's being cut and picking themselves up off the ground. They absolutely hate it. It gets under their skin. It despises them. It makes them go a little slower when that happens to them. So for somebody to say that finishing is not important is probably somebody that, one, has never played offensive line and stuck their hand in the dirt, or if you did play the offensive line, you probably weren't very good. And the final point is, you've probably never been hit in the mouth and finished as a defender, because if you did, you know that does something to your mindset. And anybody who has been in that situation, whether it be giving or receiving, will tell you that finishing is absolutely vital. And it is a critical factor of offensive line play that, again, I just absolutely view as being, you know, non-negotiable.
So I think, you know, Mayfield has in spades what Duke Manyweather just explained he has. And offensive line coaches tend to salivate on guys that have that ability. You know, offensive line coaches have egos. All coaches have egos too. You know, they think they can coach up the rest, and they want the things that you can't coach. And oftentimes that usually is reflected in the physical abilities. And with offensive linemen, it's the guys that are the raw athletic guys, like the Greg Robinsons of the world. But coaches also love having guys like Jalen Mayfield in their room too. You know, guys that may not necessarily bring the idealized skill set to the field, but are going to bring a certain mentality to that unit. And through osmosis, that's going to permeate the rest of the offensive line unit. And coaches love that, guys. And, you know, I don't know if this is much the case in today's NFL as it was, say, a decade or more ago, but there have been plenty of offensive linemen that have basically made their names as the try-hard, nasty guy than necessarily being the most skilled guys. You know, think of someone like a Richie Incognito, although to be fair to Richie Incognito, he was also a pretty good athlete when he came out of college at Nebraska 15 years ago. But I think Mayfield can bring that same sort of mentality to the Falcons offensive line room, and one of the reasons why the Falcons, I think, were attracted to him. So those are, to me, the main strength of Jalen Mayfield. We'll get into some of the question marks and concerns we have with him. So I got another audio clip I want to play in reference to Jalen Mayfield, as in doing the research for this episode stumbled across as well from Duke Manyweather's Twitter. It's a video of him asking Brian Winters, I believe at the 2019 Offensive Line Masterminds seminar, camp, or whatever you want to call it, talking about the transition, to explain his transition from a college tackle to a pro guard and what were some of the obstacles that he had to overcome. And Winters is a guy that we'll be talking about later in today's episode when when we get to the floor ceiling aspect of today's episode, but basically explains what I've mentioned before about the sort of increased speed of the game while playing inside versus outside. And I think that's a good starting point to talk off what we're going to talk about when we get further into Mayfield's ability to make that transition inside from a tackle. And it's also nice validation on my part so that when you hear me say stuff, it's not just me up here talking. So let's play that from Brian Winters.
Now, Winters, you went from playing left tackle in college then flipping opposite sides on the right guard. Talk about like the process in that, like playing left tackle, and then how that attributed, because I mean, by nature, you like to set aggressively, which is completely different from the way you played at left tackle. So talk about building your skill set in that.
I feel like, I mean, the majority of the people in this room probably started out playing outside, and a lot of them moved in. I know when, in our room in New York, the majority of everyone was a left tackle.
Yeah.
Every single person, and then they got moved in. I came from a smaller school, obviously, so I was playing left tackle, and then I moved inside. The biggest thing for me is that I just had to adjust to everything happens that much faster. Like, everything's happening quick. And for me, that was my biggest adjustment, because, at tackle, you can finesse a little bit, you can wait, and you can sit on it like, Jeff was saying, but for guard, everything is right in your face right now, so you got to have a plan right away. You don't have time to think, so you got to have a game plan and know what you got to do. So as far as if you want to be inside out, you want to jump side out, tackle, you can sit there and think about it like last second, kind of what you want to do. But my biggest adjustment was timing and speed, and that was what I really had to work on.
So when we're talking about Mayfield making that transition to guard, a lot of it is due to the fact that I don't believe that he can cut it as a tackle. And the main reasons for that is because he has slow feet and short arms, right? Without spending too much time on that, I think projecting him to the next level where pass rushers are going to be a lot more polished and better athletes is going to create a whole host of problems for him as a tackle. To me, what's interesting about Mayfield is I think one of the reasons why the perception of him at least in the pre-draft process, as a potential first or second round pick, early on was so high is I think mostly due to the perception of his performance as well as the rest of the Michigan offensive line against Chase Young and Ohio State from back in 2019. And that game is famously or maybe infamously as being the only game where Chase Young was blanked in terms of his box score stats, in terms of tackles and sacks, etc. And I think, there were a lot of articles written at the time about how Mayfield and John Runyon, Michigan's left tackle at the time, basically shut Chase Young down. And even though if you go and watch that game, you're going to not see Chase Young get shut down, he definitely had a high amount of pressures that led to a couple of sacks in that game. And I don't know exactly how many pressures Young got, but my own charting of Mayfield in that game, I gave him credit for giving up 8 hurries, 3 pressures, and 2 quarterback hits in that game. And that number would be a huge amount for an NFL game, and comparatively to a college game, it's a tremendous amount of pressure for a single player to give up in a game. And that also doesn't really include like 4 or more plays that he probably would have given up pressure if he not gotten a timely chip or help from his running back or his right guard, which is Michael Onwenu. And so when I talk about those pressures and those hurries that he gave up, only like 4 of them came against Young himself. The other ones came mostly against Jonathan Cooper, who was Ohio State's other edge rusher, who was just drafted by the Denver Broncos in the 7th round this past year. And then you watch him earlier games in 2019 against Iowa, where Chauncey Golston, who was just a 3rd round pick for Dallas this past year, was able to consistently beat him with the long arm move. And that was the thing that continued to be an issue with Mayfield, is that he was very susceptible to bull rushes and long arm moves, basically any form of power play in that tackle position. And what happens is his short arms tend to lead him to have to react to what edge rushers are doing rather than initiating that sort of contact with his punch. And you saw the same thing with Caleb McGarry when he came out of college at Washington, because he too has short arms. But I thought McGarry did a much better job countering and was much stronger in terms of controlling those guys once he made those counter moves. And as a long story short, I think as a tackle, Mayfield is at best an emergency option that in the event of a bunch of injuries, you essentially throw him out there as your like third string tackle, and you could sort of get by with him in a pinch against lesser competition. But the minute you put him out there against a premium pass rusher, he's going to get exposed, and you're going to understand immediately why he's projected as a guard and not necessarily as a tackle. So to me, the question is going to be, as he transitions inside, do some of those issues get mitigated? And I think one of the issues that we're focused on is the hand usage. As I've explained before, that engagement amongst interior guys, and as Brian Winters indicated earlier on today's episode, it happens much faster. And with Mayfield, when you watched him as a tackle, because he's reacting later, his punches are late. He's letting defenders get into his chest, and he doesn't necessarily have those counters to handle the speed and the increased speed of the game that will come at guard. And experience has taught me that those aren't lessons that are going to be learned overnight as he tries to speed up his hand usage. And especially with Mayfield, who's going to have his entire technique revamped and reworked from the ground up as an interior player. And I think fans tend to fall into the trap of not really appreciating the amount of time and energy that goes into it. And they're just thinking, you'll get him coached up over the 3 months, over the summer, and he'll be able to figure that stuff out by September. And it's not realizing that it's much more closely going to be a 3-year time span where it's going to take him to be able to coach him up to a way where he's now a serious option, a serious threat to be able to hold his own against the likes of the pass rushers that he's going to see on the interior. You just look at the first month of this season. If he were to wind up winning that left guard spot, week 1, that's Fletcher Cox and Javon Hargrave. Week 2, Ndamukong Suh and Vita Vea. Week 3, you got Dexter Lawrence for the Giants, Jonathan Allen and Deron Payne in Washington in week 4. So you're going to be thrown to the wolves, going back to a point I made earlier, if he was to be the starter right away. And it's going to take some time for him to get to a level where I think he's going to be comfortable going up against that combination of size, power, quickness, strength, and length. And so, I think part of the reason why his punching and his hands were not as effective at the college level was because he was playing tackle. And because of the limitations he has athletically playing outside, it led to his technique breaking down more easily. And it's no different than if you or I were working out, and at the beginning of our workout, our technique, our form is very good. But once fatigue starts to set in, your technique and your form tends to get very sloppy. And with Jalen Mayfield, it's not a fatigue issue, but it's when you're pushed to your athletic limitations, you start labor in some of your movements. Your brain starts to focus, okay, I need to be with my feet, and all of a sudden that focus on your hands tends to get let down. You're so worried about trying to stay in front of that speed rusher that you start not utilizing your hands, multitasking in the way that your brain operates. If it's easy movement for you to stay in front of that speed rusher, then you can much rather focus on your hands to do the things that they need to do. And you didn't necessarily see that with Jalen Mayfield. So I think with the move to guard, it should put him in a better spot to utilize his hands, but I don't think it's going to automatically solve the problem. The next point I want to get to Jalen Mayfield is scheme fit. And Michigan played a much more gap or man blocking scheme that had a heavy dose of inside zone. But from what I gleaned watching the 2019-2020 film, rarely ever ran outside zone. And as I explained on Friday's episode, I probably wound up watching the equivalent of maybe half of Mayfield's 2019 snaps. So I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert, but in all of those plays, outside zone was rarely ever utilized. And the one game where it did seem like Michigan utilized outside zone more than like 1 or 2 times was the 2019 bowl game against Alabama. And I thought Mayfield flashed enough in that game with the lateral agility and the ability to climb to the second level that you would sit there and say, yeah, he could certainly be a capable outside zone, a functional outside zone guy, but I don't know if he has quite the upside there. And to explain the difference between sort of a gap or man scheme versus a zone blocking scheme, it's very similar to how man versus zone coverage works on defense. In man coverage, your assignment is to cover one guy. Zone, you cover an area. And the same thing comes with blocking. Man blocking or gap blocking is you're blocking one guy. In zone blocking, you're blocking whoever enters your area. And, I'm by no means an expert, but, I think the reason why they refer to man blocking as a gap blocking scheme, because essentially the running back's gap that he's going to run to is predetermined. And zone blocking, it's not. That's why you see people talk a lot more about a running back's vision when he's playing in a zone blocking scheme than you necessarily have to have great vision in a gap blocking scheme. And the hallmark, the bread and butter run play of the outside zone scheme is that stretch play where you're going to see all of those offensive linemen step, laterally in one direction towards the sideline and try to make those reach blocks. And some of those guys are going to climb to the second level and take out the linebackers that enter their immediate zones. And that's why the zone blocking scheme typically favors smaller, more quicker, athletic offensive linemen than a gap blocking scheme because of those reach blocks where you're going to have to try to get to the outside shoulder of a defender, get between him and the sideline, and that defender may not be lined up over you. And so you're going to need a blocker that can cover ground quickly in order to get to that point in his zone. And so you need offensive linemen that can move. And Mayfield just wasn't great at that particular aspect. But again, he wasn't asked to do it a lot. So there is some projection there, and maybe he'll be better at that at the next level. Although, again, the athletic limitations, he just tested as an average athlete. So you don't necessarily have a high degree of expectation for him in that regard. And, the other aspect of playing in the zone blocking scheme is if you're not making that reach block, oftentimes you're climbing to the second level. And as I've explained many, many times on this podcast over the years, you're essentially functioning as that heat-seeking missile to take out linebackers and defensive backs, which then creates those creases and cutback lanes for your running back with his vision to be able to find and get those big gains that you can gash defenses with. And you want short area quickness with that in offensive linemen so that they can make those adjustments and change direction in space on the second level. It's very easy to hit a static target, but it's much harder to hit a mobile one. And, Mayfield was effective as a second level blocker, particularly when it came to hitting those static targets, but had a little bit more problems trying to hit those mobile ones, which goes to some of the athletic question marks with that short area quickness. And so to me, watching him, particularly on the second level, he reminded me a lot of a former Falcon offensive lineman in Brandon Fusco that wasn't a great fit in this outside zone scheme. Now, Fusco was an experienced player playing in San Francisco under Kyle Shanahan and playing in 2018 here in Atlanta in an outside zone scheme, but really kind of struggled hitting those second level assignments. And you've seen other interior players like Mike Person and Jamon Brown, James Carpenter, Wes Schweitzer also were guys that struggled in terms of that second level assignment hitting ability. And, all five of those players that I just mentioned had much lower ceilings as starters in this offensive line, in this offense, than, say, a Andy Levitri or a Chris Chester in that regard, at least as far as their run blocking ability. And so, again, in all of those cases, all of those players I mentioned were better athletes than Mayfield is, at least based off of their, pro day and combine testing. And so if those guys struggled being able to make those blocks on the second level, you don't have a ton of optimism that Mayfield is going to do that job any better than any of those guys I mentioned before and be on that Levitri or Chester level. So now maybe you sit there and say, well, the Falcons may not run as much outside zone as you're saying that they are, Aaron. And I would just say if they are not going to run outside zone to a high degree this year, they have a funny way of showing it because they drafted Drew Dahlman, who's considered a perfect scheme fit in that scheme. They hired Dwayne Leffert, who has installed an outside zone heavy scheme wherever he's been at the collegiate level. It's his calling card and being able to teach that scheme better than anybody else at the collegiate level. And the fact is that the Titans ran more outside zone than any other team in 2020 besides the Chicago Bears, which, by the way, the Falcons raided half of the Chicago Bears offensive coaching staff in order to build up their own coaching staff here in Atlanta. So, the two most outside zone heavy teams have a bunch of coaches here in Atlanta. And then you hear Arthur Smith talk about adapting his offense to fit the players that the Falcons already have. And then you consider that guys like Jake Matthews and Hennessy and Lindstrom and McGarry and Gano all have played some of their best football over the years playing in an outside zone scheme. So essentially you have like 9 indicators that the Falcons are going to be in a heavy outside zone scheme, and Mayfield is the one sort of exception, the one outlier in that regard, which is why, again, I have a lot of questions about this Mayfield pick. Again, not to beat a dead horse, but it's just a head scratcher for me. Where the Falcons could have potentially at that 6th to the 8th overall selection taken in a more experienced player that is more experienced in this outside zone scheme, or a player that has more athletic potential, or a player that has actually had experience playing left guard or right guard at the collegiate level. Instead, they took a guy with no guard experience, a guy with limited athletic potential and marginal experience in the scheme. And it's hard for me to get super excited about this pick without a ton of projection for Jalen Mayfield. But on that note of projection, we're going to continue and wrap up today's episode and talk about what type of player Jalen Mayfield projects to be in the NFL when we talk about his NFL comparisons for his floor, his ceiling, and his eye level. But before we get there, guys, did you know that Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar on the market, has 9 delicious flavors? I'm a big fan of the coconut almond flavor, but maybe you prefer mint brownie, cookies and cream, cherry barcia, double chocolate, peanut butter brownie, salted caramel, coconut, or raspberry. There's something for everyone, and there's also the occasional limited time flavor too, such as right now with the white chocolate birthday cake flavor available. You can try them all with a mix box, getting 2 each of all 9 flavors, or celebrate the beginning of summer with your very own healthy birthday cake. And you're sitting there wondering, how healthy can they be with flavors like birthday cake? Well, the white chocolate birthday cake has 140 calories, 17 grams of protein, 6 grams of sugar. If you tried to get the equivalent amount of protein in a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you'd be getting 4 or 5 times as much calories, 4 or 5 times as much sugar, and not getting the same amount of fiber that you would get in a Built Bar. So even though the PB&J is a solid, tried and true protein delivery vehicle, it's a classic. In terms of taste comparison, there's no comparison. What would you rather have, a PB&J or a birthday cake? It's a no-brainer. Just head over to BuiltBar.com. Use the promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your first order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off of your birthday cake at BuiltBar.com. So let's talk about the floor for Jalen Mayfield. And this is, to me, the starting point of where he's going to be. If he had to play an NFL game tomorrow, this is the type of player that I would expect him to be. And it's probably not fair, the player I'm going to compare him to, which is Drew Samia, the guard for Minnesota, because Samia's only been in the NFL for 2 years. And so we might see him develop into a much better player with more time. But Samia was interesting because he was a player at Oklahoma, started his career as a tackle, then moved to guard his final 3 years there, did not test particularly well, again, tested more like an average to below average athlete coming out. But his biggest trait, his biggest strength of his game was the toughness, the tenacity, that mean streak, very similar to Jalen Mayfield. And he was labeled a offensive line coach's dream in that regard, similar to Mayfield, wound up being a 4th round pick with the Vikings in 2019. But his first 2 years in the NFL have been very rough. He was essentially a disaster, for lack of a better term, starting 4 games for the Vikings at right guard last year, ranked 211th out of 212 graded offensive linemen by Pro Football Focus this past year, was the 2nd least efficient pass protector using their pass blocking efficiency metric this past year. By the way, the least efficient pass protector in the NFL was Josh Andrews, the player that the Falcons signed this offseason. So thumbs up on that one. But Samia struggled not only in pass protection, but also struggled hitting those assignments in the Vikings outside zone blocking scheme. And if you follow my Locked On colleague, Locked On Vikings host, Luke Braun, it was kind of a meme of sorts for him to post videos of how bad Drew Samia was early in the season. And hopefully we won't have to have that be a part of my Twitter in the near future with Jalen Mayfield. But, Samia might be a much better player 2 to 3 years from now than where we're putting him at today. But I do think, at least as a starting point, in terms of how I view Jalen Mayfield, like Samia, he's a guy that may get by and be known for his toughness and tenacity, but doesn't bring a whole lot to the table. And you do question his potential and his scheme fit. And so you could see him, if he was thrown to the wolves early, similarly struggle as his starting point entering the league. Now, let's move to the other end of the spectrum and talk about his ceiling. And the player I picked was Brian Winters, who's currently with the Arizona Cardinals, but a former New York Jet. And what's notable about this is Winters was my floor 2 years ago when I did my Chris Lindstrom comparison. So that kind of tells you the gap where I perceive Lindstrom as a prospect versus where I perceive Mayfield as a prospect. But, as I described then, Winters was a former athletic tackle, as mentioned in the audio earlier on today's episode, was moved immediately inside for the Jets, was a starter right away. And while was never considered one of the better starting guards in the NFL, as time wore on, he was able to develop into a competent, average to above average starter. Over the course of the 8 seasons in the NFL, Winters has started 88 games, 7 of which came with the Jets, and then this past year with the Bills. His highest graded season was 2016, according to Pro Football Focus, which was his 4th year in the league, where he ranked 32nd out of 63 guards in the league at that time, which is essentially league average. And that led to a contract extension the following offseason, where the Jets were looking for some stability up front after losing DeBrickashaw Ferguson the previous offseason and Nick Mangold that same offseason. And we talked about this a bit when we brought in James Carpenter 2 years ago, that after a couple of decent seasons playing left guard with the Jets, in Carpenter's case, once Mango left after the 2016 season, you saw a downturn in Carpenter's play, and you saw a similar dynamic with Winters playing that right guard position where you didn't have the stability at the center position, and you saw the guard play suffer similarly. Then that led eventually to Winters being a cap cut of the Jets this last summer, getting scooped up by the Bills. But it was essentially a situation where, the Jets couldn't justify paying Winters the money that they were paying him on that second contract when they were getting essentially average starting guard play, and coupling that with the injury issues that Winters had been dealing with the last couple of years. And so for me, at least, in terms of a ceiling, my hope for Mayfield is a similar trajectory that Brian Winters had over his rookie contract. And some of those early year struggles start to pay off for Mayfield as they did with Winters in years 3 and 4, where he started to have some of his better years. And should that lead to Mayfield earning a second contract, that you won't see a similar dip in production like you saw in Winters, because hopefully the Falcons will have a lot more stability along their offensive line, including at the center position. And when you look ahead to where the timetable of when it's time to pay Mayfield come that offseason of 2025, he's only going to be 24 years old, approaching age 25 in May of 2025. And you compare that to where other guys on the Falcons offensive line should be at that same time. Matt Hennessy will be 28. Chris Lindstrom will be 28. Drew Dahlman will be 26. Caleb McGarry will be 30. Matt Gano will be 29. And so when we're talking about Mayfield's potential and upside, that kind of illustrates it given his age, his relatively low age. And so if you can get to him to a point where you like him as a starter, like Winters was in year 3 or year 4, that could certainly pay off in terms of his longevity down the road. Age 31 is usually the age in my brain that I tend to use as a cutoff for when offensive linemen stop being good. That was the same age that Tyson Clabo and Justin Blaylock were in their final years in Atlanta. Andy Levitre's last peak season in 2018 or 2017 was at age 31. Alex Mack, players like him that can go beyond that are rare, but I would argue that his last peak season came at the age of 33 in 2018. Todd Mcclure was a similar age at 33 in his last peak year in 2010. So if you can get Mayfield to his peak in, say, year 3 when he's 23 years old, you in theory can get maybe 8 more years of his peak production. And you compare that to someone like a Caleb McGarry, who, let's say he hits his peak this year at age 26, you're only going to get maybe like 5 of those years. So I don't know if that's necessarily a positive for the Falcons, but it's a positive for Mayfield, because in theory, he could definitely has a much higher probability of getting a third lucrative contract than other players that are older than him that may be only limited to getting 2. So that brings us to our eye level for Jalen Mayfield, sort of what's the halfway point between his floor and his ceiling, which is the more achievable dream for him, which is much more likely for him to get to as an NFL player than necessarily his ceiling. And that's Winters' former teammate in John Feliciano in Buffalo. Feliciano came into the NFL as a 4th-round pick with the Raiders in 2015, played multiple positions at Miami, primarily being a guard there, and then went to the Raiders back when they were Oakland still, and basically spent the entirety of his rookie contract as a backup, as a utility backup, playing behind guys like Rodney Hudson, Kelechi Osemele, and Gabe Jackson. And when he was able to start as a spot starter for injuries and whatnot, he generally was solid, generally did more good than bad in those roles, had the versatility to play all three interior offensive line positions, guard, center, both guard spots in center. He was part of that 2019 Bills free agent class where they brought in a bunch of veteran free agents to come in and compete for starting spots on their offensive line. Feliciano wound up winning one of those starting spots at the right guard position. And, this past year was dealing with some injuries early on, and wound up replacing Winters, who the Bills brought in this year due to those Feliciano injuries. But by midseason, Feliciano won his starting right guard spot, and held on to it through the end of the season. And I feel like Feliciano is a better comparison to a guy like Mayfield because similarly was not a high tier athlete, but is a guy that's known more for winning with toughness and physicality. And while Winters was an immediate starter in New York, as I mentioned, Feliciano really didn't get his opportunity to be a full-time starter until his 5th year in the NFL. And obviously we're going to find out in a few months if Mayfield's career path follows more along the lines of Winters being an immediate starter or Feliciano's where it's in wait and see mode. But let's just say based off of the player I think Feliciano's career path makes more sense for Jalen Mayfield, a more wait and see, a long-term developmental piece than necessarily immediate starter. But obviously in Atlanta, you're not going to have the same situation he had with the Raiders where, he's going to a team that already had one of the top interior offensive lines. There's just not going to be as many good bodies in his way here in Atlanta than there were in Oakland then. But similarly, I do think probably over the better part of 4 or 5 years down the road, that's where a draft pick like in a player like Mayfield is going to start to pay off for you. And like Feliciano, I don't know if he's going to be anything to write home about as a starter. Feliciano's only year as a full-time starter, 2019, he ranked 29th out of 62 guards in the league, according to Pro Football Focus. So again, you're getting a guy that's probably going to be in that sort of average tier of players, maybe slightly above or slightly below average, similar to Winters. But unlike a guy like Winters who wound up starting, 88 games across 8 years, maybe Mayfield's more the type like Feliciano who only starts maybe 33 games so far across his 6 NFL seasons, or at least a number closer to that number, closer to 33 than 88 or so over the next, 6 to 8 years or whatever the case may be. So that's really my thoughts on Jalen Mayfield. So in conclusion, in all these cases, I kind of see Mayfield developing at best into an average NFL starter. So to me, the real conversation is whether or not you're going to get a guy that's going to start for 8 to 10 years in the NFL or a guy that's going to start for like 3 or 4 years in the NFL. And it's impossible to predict those things because it depends on so many unknowns and various unknown variables at this point in time. But obviously Mayfield will have an opportunity to earn a starting spot right away, which is not all these guys do. And so the question to me with the Falcons is, are they going to be a team that's going to be willing to let Mayfield take his lumps early on because they think it's going to pay off down the road? Maybe is the answer to that question. But as I've explained earlier on today's episode, I don't know if the payoff to that is particularly high, but we'll see how it plays out. There aren't 160 good starters along the offensive line in the NFL. There's maybe like 90 good starters in the NFL, but that still means you still have like 70 to 75 guys that you got to fill out your lineup every single week that aren't so good. And, a lot of offensive linemen, particularly in Atlanta, that we kind of look back on with generally positive opinions on that were firmly in that 70 to 75 group. Those are guys like Chris Chester, Justin Blaylock, Todd McClure. And those 3 guys have over 140 or over 460 career starts between them. And so the idea that, Jalen Mayfield could get to 120, 150, 180 games in the NFL would not completely shock me, even though I don't necessarily think he'll be starting those games at a high level. I feel like the benchmark that Mayfield can and should be able to reach is basically we just call him, Aaron, what do you think about Jalen Mayfield? Yeah, he's fine. You know, like that to me is kind of my expectation for Jalen Mayfield. And, you know, I think eventually he can get there. I just don't know if he's going to be that guy right away. And if he's not that guy right away, do the Falcons then try to bring in somebody else to replace him? And we've talked about this recently with talking about Deidre Sanat, where Deidre Sanat was solid as a rookie, but didn't bring a whole lot to the table that made you say like, oh, this guy is definitely a permanent fixture that we have to have long-term faith in as a third-round pick in 2018. And the Falcons brought in a replacement immediately the following year in Tyler Davis. We talked about this with Justin Hardy, with the Falcons bringing in Mohamed Sanu. And so that's be the question with Jalen Mayfield. If he should start right away, is he going to show enough flashes and enough potential that the Falcons are going to be willing, again, to let him take those lumps those first couple of years that it takes him before he can refine himself into a good player? Or do they just basically say, look, we can do a better job than this, similar to what they did with Brandon Fusco when they brought him in with Wes Schweitzer there. Like, Wes Schweitzer was okay as a first year starter, but the Falcons were like, look, we can potentially upgrade this spot with Brandon Fusco. They were wrong in that assessment, but they thought they could, and they weren't willing to sort of take those lumps with Schweitzer. And then you see Schweitzer go elsewhere and get better coaching and turn into a halfway decent starter for the Washington football team this past year. So it's going to be interesting to see where Mayfield winds up in his career, and maybe he winds up being a player like Todd Mcclure, because Todd Mcclure is an interesting player because the perception of Todd Mcclure post-career is very different from my experience of what fans perceive Todd Mcclure during his playing days. Like, we all sit here and love the mud deck, but if you would ask a lot of Falcon fans circa 2005, 2004, or wherever in those Chandler and Vic years, I don't think you would have heard a lot of people have positive opinions about Todd Mcclure at that point in time. But, you know, over the course of 13 years as a starter here in Atlanta, you know, he was this tried and true fixture for this offensive line. And nowadays, when people think about Todd Mcclure, they think about the consistency and the availability and the durability and all those various things, rather than necessarily the ups and down nature of his actual play on the field itself. And Justin Blaylock's similar, but not quite the same. I think generally people during Blaylock's career, people had a generally positive opinion about his ability as a player than necessarily anything else. But, you know, I think Mayfield has the potential to hit that benchmark. And if that's the benchmark he's going to hit, then so be it. You know, beggars can't be choosers at this point in time. So we'll see with Jalen Mayfield. Again, I don't have any necessarily high opinion of him as a player. I think the Falcons could have gotten better options at that pick, but, you know, they didn't. And we'll just hope that Dwayne Ledford can get Jalen Mayfield to sort of start hitting his stride sooner rather than later as a player. So there you guys have it. And before we duck out of here, I do want to let you guys know that even though I have you covered on all things Falcons, who's got you covered for the rest of sports, of course, as host Peter Bukowski on the Locked On Today podcast. It's all the sports news that you need every morning in under 20 minutes. So subscribe to the Locked On Today podcast on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts. I don't know if it'll be tomorrow's episode or later this week because I have to coordinate the schedule, but we'll have the host of Locked On Michigan in Isaiah Hole come on and probably give you a much more glowing appraisal of Jalen Mayfield's skill set later this week on Locked On Falcons. We'll have a guest come on talk about Richie Grant, and hopefully we'll have another guest come on and talk about Kyle Pitts. So you guys will not hear me complaining about a Falcons draft pick for most of the rest of the week, and you'll get some positive assessments from people that have watched several of these guys more closely than I have since the post-draft process during their playing days in college, to come on and give their assessments. And then hopefully we won't have to continue talking about Julio Jones for the rest of the week. That maybe we can save that till next week. So we'll see how that all plays out. But certainly got more for you to come on Locked On Falcons. And if you have any feedback and tell me why I'm wrong on Jalen Mayfield, you can let me know via Twitter at Locked On Falcons, via Facebook at Locked On Falcons, or you can send an email in case you have that special rant cooking of 4,000 words on why I'm wrong on Jalen Mayfield. You can send that to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. Appreciate it, guys. Until then.